December 18, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. Corporal James Hendricks pressed his body against frozen stone, breath misting in the sub-zero air. Through the skeletal trees he heard it first, a mechanical thunder that made the ground tremble beneath the boots, the sound every American infantryman had learned to fear. Not the high-pitched whine of a Sherman, not the diesel clatter of a half-track. This was deeper, primal. The guttural roar of Maybach engines pushing 70 tons of German steel through snow-covered Belgian roads. Tigers. His loader, Private Eugene Garrett, gripped the M9A1 Bazooka rocket like a rosary, knuckles white against the olive-drab casing. Around them, the ruins of a roadside hamlet offered concealment. Shattered walls, overturned carts, the skeletal remains of what had been someone's home 3 days earlier. Hendricks could see them now. Dark shapes emerging through the morning fog, turrets swiveling like the heads of prehistoric predators. 1, 2. He stopped counting at 5. Garrett whispered a question that had no good answer. How close do we let them get? Hendricks loaded the first rocket into the tube. His hands were steady. They wouldn't be for long. The Tiger tank had earned its reputation in blood. Since its combat debut at Leningrad in August 1942, the Panzerkampfwagen 6 had become the most feared weapon on any battlefield where it appeared. Its thick armor, up to 120 millimeters on the frontal hull and turret, could deflect almost every Allied anti-tank round fired at combat ranges. The 88mm main gun, derived from the legendary Flak 88 anti-aircraft cannon, could punch through enemy armor at distances exceeding 2 kilometers. When a Tiger crew acquired a target, that target rarely survived. American tank crews knew the mathematics of despair. A single Tiger could engage and destroy 4 or 5 Shermans before being knocked dead out, and that was only if the Shermans had numerical superiority and room to maneuver. The official tactical doctrine was brutally honest: avoid Tigers when possible, call in air support or artillery when not, and never engage frontally unless absolutely necessary. Infantry feared them even more. Against foot soldiers, the Tiger was a mobile fortress that could shrug off small arms fire, demolish buildings with high explosive shells, and sweep defensive positions clean with its hull-mounted machine guns. By December 1944, Germany's armored reserves had been carefully husbanded for one final desperate gamble. Operation Wacht am Rhein, what the Allies would call the Battle of the Bulge, represented Hitler's last attempt to split the American and British armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. The offensive required every available Tiger tank. Battalions that had been held in strategic reserve were committed to the assault. Maintenance crews performed miracles to get damaged vehicles operational again. Even training units surrendered their machines to combat formations. The Ardennes Forest was chosen specifically because Allied intelligence considered it impassable for large-scale armored operations. The dense woods, narrow roads, and steep valleys seemed natural barriers against mechanized warfare. But German planners knew these roads. They had driven them in 1940 during the invasion of France, when the so-called impenetrable Ardennes had become a highway for blitzkrieg. Now, 4 years later, the same terrain would serve them again. When the offensive began on December 16th, American forces were caught completely unprepared. Entire divisions, many containing green replacement troops enjoying what they believed was a quiet sector, found themselves facing the full fury of Germany's armored elite. SS Panzer divisions, Fallschirmjäger paratroopers, and Volksgrenadier infantry poured through gaps in the American lines. The weather grounded Allied aircraft, negating the overwhelming air superiority that had protected ground forces since Normandy. For the first time in months, German armor could move without fear of thunderbolts and typhoons screaming down from above. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Units that had pushed steadily eastward since June suddenly found themselves retreating westward. Roadblocks were overrun, supply dumps were abandoned, entire regiments found themselves cut off, surrounded in villages and crossroads that became desperate islands in a German tide. Radio traffic filled with panicked reports of Tigers and Panthers appearing where no German armor should exist. The offensive's speed and violence shattered the comfortable assumption that the war was nearly won. Into this chaos came the infantry anti-tank teams. These small units, typically 2 or 3 men carrying a single bazooka, represented the last line of defense when friendly armor was unavailable and enemy tanks threatened to break through. Their mission was simple in theory, suicidal in practice: get close enough to fire, hit the target in a vulnerable location, and survive long enough to reload if the first shot failed. The average life expectancy of a bazooka team engaging heavy armor was measured in minutes. The M1 bazooka had been revolutionary when it first appeared in North Africa in 1942. For the first time, ordinary infantrymen possessed a weapon that could actually damage enemy tanks. The shape-charge warhead used explosive physics discovered just before the war. When detonated properly, the charge formed a superheated jet of metal that could penetrate armor far thicker than the warhead itself. In theory, a single soldier could stop a Panzer with one well-placed shot. Reality proved more complicated. The original M1 and improved M1A1 models fired a 2.36-inch rocket with limited range and questionable reliability. Electrical firing systems often failed in wet conditions. The weapon had to be braced carefully to avoid injuring the operator from backblast. Accuracy beyond 100 yards was optimistic at best. Most critically, the shaped charge warhead struggled against the heaviest German armor. Against a Panzer III or early Panzer IV, the bazooka was deadly. Against a Tiger, it was a desperation weapon. The M9 and M9A1 variants introduced in 1944 offered improvements, better sights, more reliable firing mechanisms, slightly enhanced penetration, but the fundamental problem remained. To knock out a Tiger, a bazooka team had to hit it where it was vulnerable: the side armor, the rear engine deck, the thin plates protecting the turret ring. This meant getting close, often suicidally close, and firing from angles that exposed the team to devastating return fire. Training emphasized patience and positioning. Bazooka teams were taught to let tanks pass, to fire from behind, to aim for tracks and mechanical components rather than thick frontal armor. They learned to use terrain, to hide in buildings or behind rubble, to coordinate with other infantry units who could provide suppressing fire. The manual was clear about one thing: never reveal your position with a shot that would not achieve a kill. A missed shot or a superficial hit meant immediate retaliation from a tank crew who now knew exactly where you were. Hendricks and Garrett had trained together at Fort Benning in the spring of 1944. They had practiced on wrecked American tanks painted with German markings, learning the angles and distances by repetition until the movements became automatic: load, brace, aim, fire, clear, reload. The instructors had been veterans from Italy and North Africa, men who had actually engaged enemy armor and survived. Their lessons carried the weight of hard experience. Do not fire at maximum range hoping for a lucky hit. Do not engage multiple targets without support. Do not assume one hit will stop a heavy tank. Most importantly, always have an escape route planned, because even a destroyed tank could kill you with ammunition cook-off or accompanying infantry. The 99th Infantry Division, to which their company belonged, had arrived in the Ardennes in early November. They were a fresh unit, having completed training stateside and crossed the Atlantic in October. The division had been assigned to what senior officers called a rest sector, quiet woods and scattered villages where veteran units could recuperate and new divisions could gain experience without facing serious combat. For 5 weeks, that assessment had been accurate. Patrols encountered occasional German scouts, artillery exchanged desultory fire. The greatest dangers were frostbite and boredom. December 16th changed everything. The German offensive struck the 99th Division's positions with overwhelming force. Within hours, entire battalions were fighting for survival. Communications broke down. Supply lines were severed. Units retreated to defensible positions and waited for help that was slow to arrive. Hendricks and Garrett's company had been assigned to hold a crossroads village 4 miles behind what had been the front line 2 days earlier. Now that front line no longer existed, and the village sat directly in the path of a German armored column pushing toward the Meuse River. The hamlet had no name on American maps, just a cluster of stone buildings where 2 roads intersected. Tactically, it was insignificant. A place for farmers to gather, a few houses, a church with a collapsed steeple. But the roads mattered. One led north toward Elsenborn Ridge, where American forces were establishing a defensive line. The other ran west toward supply depots and reinforcement routes. If German armor secured this crossroads, they could exploit the breakthrough and widen the bulge that was forming in Allied lines. Hendricks's platoon numbered 37 men when they dug in around the village on the evening of December 17th. They had 2 bazooka teams, 3 Browning automatic rifles, an assortment of rifles and carbines, and exactly 6 anti-tank mines that nobody was certain how to properly deploy. No artillery support was available. The nearest friendly tanks were 15 miles north, fully engaged with their own problems. Air support was impossible. Thick clouds and snow had grounded every aircraft in the sector. The platoon lieutenant, a 23-year-old from Pennsylvania, was honest about their situation. Hold as long as possible. inflict casualties on any German units that came through, and withdraw if overwhelmed by forces they could not stop. That night, the temperature dropped below zero. Men took turns on watch, stamping feet and blowing on fingers to maintain circulation. In the darkness, they could hear engines to the east, heavy engines, tank engines, lots of them. Hendricks checked his ammunition for the dozenth time. 6 rockets, each weighing nearly 4 pounds, each representing one chance to kill something. Garrett prayed quietly, lips moving in the starlight. Neither man slept. By dawn, the sound of approaching armor had become unmistakable, and with the gray winter light came the shapes they had dreaded seeing, the terror of fall. Acing a tiger was not abstract. It lived in the gut of every man who had seen what an 88mm shell could do to a human body. The high-explosive rounds detonated with enough force to collapse buildings. The armor-piercing shot could pass through a Sherman tank lengthwise, entering the front glacis and exiting through the rear plate, killing everyone inside before they understood they had been hit. For infantry caught in the open, there was no defense except concealment and prayer. The Tiger's machine guns, one coaxial with the main gun, another in the hull, could sweep a field clear of defenders in seconds. Stories circulated through the ranks, growing with each retelling. A Tiger that had destroyed an entire American armored platoon at Villers-Bocage in Normandy, knocking out 12 tanks in 15 minutes. Another that had held a bridge against British forces for 3 hours, killing anything that tried to cross. Some stories claimed Tigers were impervious to anything smaller than a howitzer. Others insisted that their crews were SS fanatics who would fight to the death rather than surrender. Truth and myth blended together until the Tiger became more than a machine. It became a symbol of German military superiority, a reminder that American industrial might had not yet produced a tank that could face Germany's best on equal terms. This psychological weight bore down on Hendricks as he watched the column approach. His training said to remain calm, to breathe slowly, to focus on the technical aspects of his task. But training had been conducted under a Florida sun with instructors watching and medical teams on standby. Here in sub-zero cold with enemy armor grinding toward his position, every instinct screamed to run. Only the presence of Garrett beside him, equally terrified but holding position, kept Hendricks from doing exactly that. Neither man wanted to be the first to break. The composition of a bazooka team was deceptively simple. 2 men, 1 weapon. A shared burden of responsibility that could not be delegated or divided. The gunner, Hendricks, carried the launcher tube itself, a 5-foot length of steel tubing that weighed 13 pounds empty. His role required steady hands, good judgment about distance and angle, and the nerve to remain exposed long enough to aim properly. Missing was not acceptable. A wasted shot meant no second chance. Garrett, as loader, carried the rockets and handled the dangerous work of arming each round. The M6A3 rockets used IMP, ACT fuses that had to be activated before firing. This meant removing a safety pin, checking that the electrical contact was clean, and inserting the rocket into the rear of the tube while ensuring the wire leads connected properly to the firing mechanism. In combat, with adrenaline flooding the system and hands shaking from cold and fear, this process took between 8 and 12 seconds if everything went perfectly. Any fumble, any dropped rocket or disconnected wire, and those seconds stretched into eternity while enemy fire searched for their position. The relationship between gunner and loader transcended normal military hierarchy. They depended on each other absolutely. A brilliant gunner was useless if his loader panicked and failed to keep him supplied. An efficient loader could do nothing if his gunner froze or fired wildly. Success required synchronization developed through repetition and trust built through shared danger. Hendricks and Garrett had that synchronization. They had drilled together until loading and firing became a single fluid motion. Now they would discover if training could overcome the reality of combat. Terrain offered their only advantage. The village ruins provided concealment and covered approaches. Stone walls, though partially collapsed, still offered protection against small arms fire and shell fragments. The road curved as it entered the village, forcing vehicles to slow down or risk sliding off into drainage ditches on either side. Most critically, several buildings stood close enough to the road that a hidden bazooka team could achieve flanking shots against passing armor. The Germans would know this. They would expect anti-tank teams in such obvious positions. But knowing danger exists and preventing it are different problems, especially for armored vehicles moving in column on a narrow road. German tactical vulnerabilities stemmed from circumstances beyond their control. The offensive's success had created its own problems. Fuel shortages plagued every armored unit. Captured American supply dumps helped, but the consumption rate of tanks and trucks far exceeded available reserves. This meant vehicles could not afford to bypass resistance. Every defended position had to be cleared or suppressed quickly to maintain momentum. The Tigers approaching Hendricks' position were not on a seek-and-destroy mission. They were part of a breakthrough column racing toward objectives before American reinforcements could seal the penetration. This created pressure on the German crews to move fast, to keep rolling, to trust their armor and firepower to overwhelm scattered resistance. Standard doctrine called for infantry to screen armored advances, to clear villages before tanks entered, to suppress anti-tank positions with mortars and machine gun fire. But infantry moved slowly in deep snow through dense woods. Waiting for foot soldiers to clear every hamlet and crossroads would squander the speed that made armored warfare effective, so the tanks pushed ahead, accepting calculated risks because the alternative was strategic failure. The Tigers themselves carried vulnerabilities that Allied intelligence had documented carefully. Side armor was thinner than frontal protection, 80 millimeters compared to 120. The engine deck at the rear, covered by armored louvers for cooling, offered an even weaker target. The turret ring, where the rotating turret met the hull, was protected by only a thin collar of metal. A penetrating hit in any of these locations could disable or destroy the tank. The challenge was achieving such a hit before the crew realized they were under attack. The human element of courage under fire cannot be trained into existence. Either a man possesses the capacity to function when death becomes probable, or he does not. Military training attempts to develop this capacity through stress inoculation, through exposing soldiers to simulated danger until their minds accept fear as manageable rather than paralyzing. But simulation has limits. Live fire exercises cannot replicate the existential terror of watching 70 tons of steel approach your hiding place, knowing that your life depends on actions you will take in the next 60 seconds. Hendricks discovered reserves within himself he had not known existed. His hands did not shake as he braced the bazooka against his shoulder. His breathing remained controlled, each inhalation deliberate, each exhalation steady. This was not absence of fear. His heart hammered against his ribs hard enough to hurt, and his mouth had gone dry despite the cold. But the fear was contained, channeled into focus. He watched the lead Tiger through the launcher's simple sight, calculating range and angle, waiting for the perfect moment that might not come. Garrett experienced something different. His fear manifested as hyper-awareness, a heightened perception where every sound and movement registered with crystal clarity. He could hear the creak of tank suspension, the clank of tracks against frozen ground, even the muffled voices of crew members talking inside their steel fortress. His hands worked automatically, checking the rocket, confirming the safety pin was free, positioning himself to load the instant Hendricks fired. The training had worked. His body knew what to do even as his mind struggled with the implications of what they were about to attempt. Technical factors would determine success or failure as much as courage. The M6A3 rocket had an effective range of approximately 150 yards against moving targets. Beyond that distance, the unguided projectile dropped too quickly and drifted too much for reliable hits. Closer was better, but closer also meant easier detection and less reaction time if something went wrong. Hendricks had chosen a position 40 yards from the road, close enough for accuracy, far enough to avoid immediate detection. The angle would be perfect once the Tigers committed to the road curve. Penetration depended on impact angle and target location. A perpendicular hit against side armor would allow the shape charge to focus its energy into a concentrated jet capable of punching through 80 millimeters of steel. An oblique hit, where the rocket struck at an angle, would dissipate energy across a larger surface area and might fail to penetrate. This meant Hendricks could not fire too early, while the tanks were still angled away from his position. He had to wait until they turned, presenting their flanks, offering that brief window where geometry favored the attacker. The weak points on a Tiger were well documented but difficult to exploit. The lower hull sides below the main armor belt were protected by only 60 millimeters of plate. The engine compartment rear, with its cooling vents and exhaust system, was vulnerable to any penetrating hit that could reach fuel lines or ammunition storage. The turret ring could be jammed with a precise hit, preventing traverse and rendering the main gun unable to engage targets outside a narrow arc. But achieving these hits required not just skill, but luck. The luck of perfect timing, of the target moving exactly where expected, of the rocket flying true despite winter wind and cold, thickened propellant. Hendricks understood that destroying 9 Tigers would require more than skill and favorable terrain. It would require the Germans to make mistakes, to become careless or predictable, to continue moving forward even as their lead elements died. This seemed unlikely. Tank crews were not stupid. After the first or second loss, they would halt, reverse, suppress the ambush position with high explosive shells and machine gun fire. Standard doctrine dictated this response. The question was whether desperation and time pressure would override doctrine, whether the German commanders would value speed over caution enough to keep pushing into a kill zone. The sound of engines grew louder. Through gaps in the ruined walls, Hendricks could see the lead Tiger clearly now. Snow had accumulated on its hull, white covering dark gray paint. The long 88mm barrel protruded like an accusing finger. Tracks chewed frozen ground, throwing up chunks of earth and ice. Behind it, more shapes materialized. A second Tiger, a third, then two more. 5 in line, spaced perhaps 50 yards apart, moving at the walking pace armored columns adopt when roads are uncertain and ambush is possible. Garrett whispered without taking his eyes from the rockets. 5. Jesus Christ, 5 of them. Hendricks did not respond. He was counting distance, watching the lead tank approach the curve, waiting for the moment when its path would bring it perpendicular to his position. His finger rested lightly on the trigger lever. The first shot would determine everything. Kill the lead tank, block the road, force the others to bunch up or attempt to maneuver around the obstacle. That was the theory. That was the hope. In 20 seconds, he would discover if hope was enough. The first rocket left the launcher at 08:47 hours with a sound like tearing canvas. Hendricks had squeezed the trigger just as the lead Tiger's side armor came perpendicular to his position, 42 yards away, moving at perhaps 3 miles per hour. The rocket covered the distance in less than a second, a gray blur trailing white smoke. It struck the Tiger precisely where the turret met the hull, slightly forward of center. The detonation was surprisingly quiet, a sharp crack rather than a thunderous explosion, but the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The shaped charge jet punched through the armor and into the crew compartment, superheated metal spraying across confined space. The Tiger lurched to a halt, engine still running, but the crew suddenly fighting an inferno instead. Eyed their steel coffin. Smoke began pouring from the turret hatches. Within 5 seconds, the commander had emerged, his uniform burning, tumbling from the tank into snow that hissed and steamed. The driver's hatch never opened. Garrett already had the second rocket loaded. His hands were steady, movements precise, exactly as trained. Hendricks shifted aim to the second Tiger, which had stopped 30 yards behind the lead vehicle. The crew inside had seen their leader take a hit but could not yet identify where the shot had originated. Their turret began traversing left, searching for targets. Hendricks did not give them time to find one. The second shot caught the Tiger in the lower hull just below the main armor belt. This hit was less precise but equally effective. The rocket penetrated into the fighting compartment where ammunition was stored. The tank did not explode. German ammunition safety procedures were excellent, but internal fires began immediately. The crew had perhaps 30 seconds before heat would detonate propellant charges or ignite fuel lines. They took 15 seconds to realize this. 3 men emerged from hatches, hands raised, uniforms smoking. The gunner and loader never made it out. The third Tiger in line made the decision that would doom the rest of the column. Instead of reversing, instead of backing away from the ambush site, the commander ordered his driver forward. Perhaps he believed he could crush the anti-tank position with sheer mass. Perhaps he thought the Bazooka team would retreat after exposing themselves. Perhaps he simply panicked and defaulted to aggression. Whatever his reasoning, the Tiger accelerated, trying to squeeze past the burning lead tank that partially blocked the road. Hendricks waited. Patience now would pay dividends. The Tiger committed to the narrow gap, tracks grinding against the road edge, angling its hull to fit through the space between the disabled tank and the drainage ditch. This maneuver exposed the entire length of its side armor, presenting a target that required no compensation for angle or deflection. At 35 yards, Hendricks fired his third rocket. This one struck behind the turret in the engine deck area. The jet penetrated cooling louvers and cut into the Maybach power plant. Fuel lines ruptured, oil ignited. Within seconds, the rear of the tank was engulfed in flames that made rescue impossible. The crew tried to evacuate, but fire blocked both rear hatches. Screams carried across the frozen morning air, brief and terrible, then silent as smoke, inhalation, or flames claimed them. 3 Tigers destroyed in 90 seconds. The column behind was now fully alerted, but the road offered no room to maneuver, and reversing meant abandoning the advance. The 4th and 5th tanks halted, turrets searching for the threat. Hendricks and Garrett had already displaced, moving 15 yards to a secondary position behind a collapsed barn wall. This was doctrine. Never fire more than 2 shots from the same location. Movement attracted attention, but remaining static guaranteed retaliation once the enemy fixed your position. The fourth Tiger fired blind. Its 88-millimeter gun roared, sending a high-explosive shell into the building where Hendricks and Garrett had been hiding. Stone and timber detonated into fragments, the blast wave audible even over engine noise. If they had remained in position, the explosion would have killed them both. Instead, they were already settling into the new firing point, Garrett loading the fourth rocket while Hendricks acquired the new target. The German commander had made a decision. More Tigers were stacked up behind the disabled lead tanks, unable to advance but unwilling to withdraw. Infantry support was nowhere in sight, scattered through the woods, unable to keep pace with the armored column. The decision was to suppress the American position with overwhelming firepower, then push through while the defenders were pinned down. It was a reasonable plan. It might even have worked against a larger unit. Against 2 men with a single bazooka, it failed because Hendricks and Garrett were not where the Germans believed them to be. The 4th and 5th Tigers both fired again, targeting the original ambush site. Shells exploded among ruins already destroyed, achieving nothing but noise and smoke. While they reloaded, Hendricks fired his 4th rocket at the 5th Tiger, now clearly visible at 60 yards. The range was longer than ideal, but the target was stationary, presenting a perfect side shot. The rocket struck low, punching through the sponson armor and into the crew compartment. This hit was the most devastating yet. The shaped charge jet found ammunition storage, and the result was immediate. The Tiger's turret lifted off its ring in a gout of flame and smoke, rising 10 feet before crashing down at an angle. Everyone inside died instantly, their bodies vaporized by exploding propellant. The violence of the detonation was enough to kill the commander of the 6th Tiger, struck by debris while he leaned from his cupola trying to spot the American position. Garrett was already loading the 5th rocket, but his hands were shaking now. Adrenaline and exertion were taking their toll. The rocket fumbled, almost dropped, caught at the last instant. Hendricks waited, forcing himself to remain calm, to not rush the loader. 8 seconds passed. 10. Then the rocket slid home and Garrett slapped his shoulder to signal ready. The 4th Tiger had begun reversing, its commander finally recognizing that advancing was suicide, but the narrow road and disabled tanks behind limited his options. The driver was trying to back around the first burning Tiger, maneuvering in minimal space, focused on not sliding into the ditch. This left the tank nearly motionless for 5 critical seconds. Hendricks fired. The 5th rocket hit the turret ring, exactly where training manuals identified as the optimal target. The jet cut through the thin collar of metal and jammed the traverse mechanism. The turret froze in place, unable to turn. The crew realized immediately what had happened. They were now defenseless against any threat outside their gun's limited arc. The commander ordered evacuation. 4 men emerged, hands raised, surrendering to an enemy they still had not seen. 5 Tigers destroyed or disabled in less than 4 minutes. 4 crews dead or captured, and still more tanks waited behind the wreckage, unable to advance but not yet willing to admit defeat. The morning was young. The battle was far from over. Hendricks had 1 rocket remaining in his immediate supply. 6 more were cached in the village, assuming they could reach them without being killed. 40 minutes had not yet passed. The killing had barely begun. The pause lasted 30 seconds. Neither side moved. The German column had lost its momentum, stalled behind burning wrecks that blocked the road. American infantry, inspired by the Bazooka team's success, began firing fleas and automatic weapons at the remaining tanks, rounds sparking harmlessly off armor but adding to the chaos and confusion. Hendricks used the pause to assess their situation. They had achieved something remarkable, but sustainability was the new problem. 6 rockets remained in the cache, but reaching it required crossing 50 yards of open ground now covered by German machine guns. The surviving Tigers had begun suppressing possible firing positions, methodically demolishing buildings with high explosive shells. Stone walls that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble in seconds. Fire was spreading through the village, fed by shattered timbers and collapsed roofs. Smoke provided concealment but also confusion. Hendricks could not see the entire column anymore, could not track which tanks were maneuvering and which remained static. Garrett pointed toward the church ruins. "We can reach the cache from there, through the basement." It was a risk. Movement invited detection. But staying in position with 1 rocket meant becoming irrelevant once that final shot was fired. Hendricks nodded. They moved low and fast, using smoke and rubble for concealment, expecting at any moment to hear the rip of machine gun fire that would cut them down. But the Germans were focused elsewhere, still trying to locate the primary ambush site. 20 seconds of scrambling brought them to the church basement entrance. The cache was intact, 6 rockets, still in their protective tubes, stacked against the stone foundation wall. Garrett grabbed 3, Hendricks took the other 3, and they moved to a new firing position inside the church itself. The roof was gone, walls partially collapsed, but the thick stone provided excellent protection and firing ports faced directly onto the road. From this angle, Hendricks could see the 6th and 7th Tigers maneuvering, trying to create a space to push past the disabled lead tanks. The 6th Tiger had lost its commander to debris from the earlier ammunition explosion, but the crew was continuing the fight. The gunner had assumed command, directing the driver to angle forward, attempting to nose past the wreckage. This maneuver exposed the tank's frontal armor, the thickest protection, essentially immune to bazooka fire at any angle. But it also required the driver to focus entirely on navigation, and the gunner-turned-commander was splitting attention between commanding the tank and searching for targets. Hendricks waited. Patience had worked before. The Tiger inched forward, tracks grinding, pushing against a burned-out wreck to force it aside. Metal screeched against metal. The tank's nose rose as it climbed over debris, tilting upward, exposing the thinner belly armor. Hendricks fired his 6th rocket at an angle he would never have attempted in training. The shot was pure desperation geometry. The rocket struck the underside of the hull as the tank teetered on wreckage, the shaped charge jet penetrating the thin bottom plate and into the crew compartment. The effect was immediate. Flames erupted from hatches as fuel lines ruptured. The driver abandoned his controls, and the Tiger slid backward off the wreckage, turret slewing wildly as the dead gunner's body fell against the traverse controls. The tank rolled into the ditch and stopped, burning fiercely enough that ammunition began cooking off, shells detonating inside the hull with muffled thumps. 6 Tigers destroyed, but the Germans were adapting. The 7th tank did not advance. Instead, it fired a smoke shell that detonated among the ruins, adding chemical fog to the existing haze. Under cover of this screen, infantry finally arrived, 2 squads of Panzer grenadiers who had been trailing the column. They moved tactically, using cover, suppressing windows and firing positions with MP-40 BU, bursts, and rifle grenades. American infantry responded. The firefight became general, rifles against submachine guns, automatic weapons dueling across 50 yards of smoke-filled ruins. Hendricks ignored the small arms battle. His focus remained on the armor. Through gaps in the smoke, he could see the 8th Tiger attempting what the others had failed to achieve, reversing away from the ambush site, withdrawing to a position where it could deploy properly. This was tactically sound but operationally disastrous. The retreat would admit failure, would acknowledge that a single American bazooka team had stopped an entire armored column. More critically, reversing would block other tanks trying to advance, creating a traffic jam that would waste hours the Germans could not afford. The tank commander knew this. He hesitated. Turret traversing, clearly torn between tactical wisdom and operational necessity. Hendricks made the decision for him. The 7th rocket struck the Tiger's side armor while it was still reversing, hitting just below the turret. The penetration was clean, the jet cutting into the fighting compartment and igniting propellant charges. The crew evacuated quickly, professionally, rolling from hatches and running for cover. But their tank was finished, adding another wreck to the road obstacle. 7 Tigers destroyed or abandoned in perhaps 20 minutes. The German advance had become a German disaster. But 3 more tanks remained in the column, and their commanders had finally coordinated a response. While the 8th and 9th Tigers fired suppressing rounds, the 10th tank, a newer Tiger II with even thicker armor, attempted to push through using pure mass and protection. The Tiger II was a beast that made the standard Tiger look modest. Its frontal armor exceeded 180 millimeters in places, thick enough to laugh at bazooka rockets. Its long 88mm gun could kill any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 3 kilometers. If it reached the village proper, if it broke through the roadblock, it would be unstoppable. Hendricks had 4 rockets remaining. Against a Tiger II's frontal armor, they would be as effective as throwing rocks. Garrett understood the problem without being told. "We can't kill that thing from here." Hendricks was already moving, grabbing 2 rockets, leaving the others for Garrett to carry. The plan formed as he ran: circle around, use buildings for cover, achieve a flank or rear shot where even a Tiger II was vulnerable. It was desperation, but desperation had been working. 20 yards, 40, machine gun fire sought them, tracers snapping past, stone chips spraying from near misses. Then they were in the ruins of what had been a stable, gasping, pressed against walls that might not stop the next burst. The Tiger II was grinding forward, its massive weight crushing wreckage, shoving disabled tanks aside. Behind it, the 8th and 9th Tigers were advancing again, emboldened by the heavy tank's seeming invulnerability. If the column broke through, if they reached open ground beyond the village, the American line would collapse. Everything depended on the next 2 minutes. Hendricks positioned himself at a corner where a collapsed wall created a firing port aimed at the road junction. The angle was extreme, nearly 90 degrees to the Tiger II's path. When it passed, he would have one clear shot at the engine deck. One chance. Miss or fail to penetrate, and the tank would simply continue forward while its escorts killed him. The Tiger II entered the kill zone at 09:20 hours, 33 minutes. Had elapsed since Hendricks fired his first rocket. His hands were numb from cold and stress. His shoulder ached from bazooka recoil, but his focus was absolute. The massive tank filled his sight picture, tracks clanking, engine roaring. He could see the commander in the cupola, scanning for threats, not yet realizing the danger. Hendricks fired at 12 yards, point-blank range for anti-armor combat. The rocket struck the engine deck squarely, penetrating the louvers and detonating inside the engine compartment. The Maybach power plant died instantly, fuel lines severed, oil spraying across hot metal. Fire followed immediately. The Tiger II lurched to a halt, blocking the road more effectively than any of the lighter tanks had managed. The crew evacuated, but the damage was done. The breakthrough had failed. 8 Tigers destroyed. 2 more remained, the 8th and 9th in the original column, now trapped behind a burning Tiger II and 7 wrecked lighter tanks. Their commanders faced an impossible choice. Continue forward over obstacles that might bog down their tanks, or retreat and admit the offensive had stalled. While they hesitated, Hendricks and Garrett repositioned again, working their way toward a vantage point overlooking the stalled column. The 9th Tiger made its decision. The commander ordered his driver to attempt going around, off-road, using the open ground beside the drainage ditch. It was risky. The snow concealed ground conditions and a bogged tank would be helpless. But remaining static under fire from an unseen enemy was equally untenable. The Tiger turned, tracks biting into snow, angling away from the road. Garrett loaded the 9th rocket. Hendricks tracked the maneuvering tank, waiting for the moment when its side would present a clear target. The Tiger was moving slowly, cautiously, the driver feeling out the ground. 20 yards from the road, it began to settle, tracks sinking into softer earth hidden beneath snow. The driver tried to power through, engine roaring, but physics had already won. The 70-ton machine sank to its sponsons and stopped, tracks spinning uselessly. Hendricks fired. At 40 yards against a stationary target, the shot was routine. The rocket penetrated the side armor below the turret, and flames began almost immediately. The crew evacuated into snow that was now their prison. They would either surrender or freeze before they could reach German lines. The 9th Tiger burned, black smoke adding to the pall hanging over the battlefield. 1 tank remained. The 8th Tiger, now alone, its crew watching 9 other tanks burn or die around them. Survival instinct warred with duty. The commander's voice crackled over the radio net, audible to nearby German infantry. He was requesting permission to withdraw, permission that was denied. Orders were to push through, to maintain momentum, to accept losses for the sake of the offensive. The commander acknowledged. His crew knew what that meant. The 8th Tiger advanced into the kill zone deliberately, almost slowly, as if the crew understood they were driving toward death but refused to flinch from it. Hendricks watched them come, feeling something unexpected. Respect for courage, even enemy courage, even courage in service of a cause he was fighting to destroy. Then the moment passed, and he was simply a soldier doing his job. The final rocket, number 10, struck the 8th Tiger in the turret ring at 09:26 hours. The tank shuddered to a halt, turret jammed, main gun pointing uselessly skyward. The crew did not evacuate immediately. They sat inside their disabled machine for perhaps 30 seconds, perhaps coming to terms with survival or mourning comrades who had not been as fortunate. Then the hatches opened and 5 men emerged, hands raised, walking slowly through snow toward American positions. 40 minutes had elapsed from first shot to last. 10 Tigers, 9 destroyed, 1 captured intact, lay scattered across a quarter-mile of Belgian road. Hendricks set down the bazooka and discovered his hands were shaking uncontrollably. Garrett was sitting in the snow, staring at nothing, his face gray with shock and exhaustion. Around them, American infantry were cheering, but the sound seemed distant, unreal, disconnected from the violence they had just survived. The immediate battlefield assessment began even before the smoke cleared. American infantry moved cautiously among the wrecks, checking for survivors, securing prisoners, ensuring disabled tanks were truly dead, and not playing possum with live crews waiting to ambush rescuers. Medics attended to the German wounded, 4 tank crew members with severe burns, 3 with broken bones from emergency evacuations, 2 in shock but otherwise intact. The American casualties were remarkably light, 3 wounded from shell fragments, none killed. The Bazooka team that had done most of the killing had not suffered a scratch. The captured German prisoners numbered 17 men, survivors from 10 tank crews that should have totaled 50 soldiers. 33 men had died in the span of less than an hour, most burned alive inside steel coffins or killed by shape-charged jets that vaporized flesh and bone. The survivors sat in the snow under guard, still wearing tanker coveralls stained with oil and blood, their faces blank with the shock of catastrophic loss. Several were crying quietly, tears freezing on their cheeks. These were not the fanatical SS warriors of Allied propaganda, but ordinary soldiers, many just 19 or 20 years old, who had expected their armor to protect them and learned too late that expectations mean nothing against well-placed shots. The interrogation officer, a captain from Division Intelligence, arrived within 2 hours and began processing prisoners. Most were too traumatized to resist questioning. They confirmed what American officers had suspected. The Tiger Column had been part of Kampfgruppe Piper, the spearhead of the 6th Panzer Army's offensive thrust toward the Meuse. The tanks destroyed here represented nearly a third of the heavy armor assigned to the breakthrough attempt. Their mission had been to punch through American defenses at this crossroads, then race west to capture fuel dumps and bridges before Allied reserves could establish a coherent defensive line. The tactical impact was immediate and significant. With the crossroads held and the Tiger Battalion gutted, Kampfgruppe Piper's advance stalled. Other German units attempting to exploit the penetration found their routes blocked by burning tanks and American infantry who had been given time to dig in and prepare proper defenses. The delay cost the Germans their one irreplaceable resource, momentum. Every hour that passed allowed American reinforcements to arrive, artillery to register, defensive fire zones, and air support to prepare strikes once the weather cleared. Colonel Harold Barclay, commanding the 99th Division's forward elements, visited the battlefield that afternoon. He walked among the wrecks, counting kills, examining shot placement, trying to reconstruct the engagement from physical evidence. When he finally met Hendricks and Garrett, he had trouble reconciling the 2 exhausted young men with the destruction they had caused. His report, filed that evening and forwarded up the chain of command, was succinct. 2-man Bazooka team engaged superior enemy armor at close range. 10 Tigers destroyed or disabled in approximately 40 minutes. No American casualties in the anti-tank team. Recommend both men for appropriate valor awards. The German losses were documented with clinical precision. Tiger number 1, Commander Oberfeldwebel Klaus Reinhardt, killed in vehicle by initial penetrating hit. Tiger number 2, crew survived, vehicle destroyed. Tiger 3, entire crew burned to death during evacuation attempt. Tiger 4, crew surrendered after mobility kill. Tiger 5, crew killed instantly by ammunition detonation. Tiger 6, crew killed by ammunition detonation except commander who died from shrapnel. Tiger 7, crew survived, vehicle destroyed. Tiger 8, crew killed in fuel fire. Tiger 9, crew captured after vehicle immobilized. Tiger 10, crew captured after turret mechanism jammed. The physical evidence told the story that would be studied in military academies for decades afterward. Every destroyed tank bore evidence of side or rear hits, not a single frontal penetration, because Hendricks had understood that attacking German armor from the front was suicide. The shot placement was remarkably consistent, targeting the weakest armor zones with precision that suggested either exceptional training or exceptional battle field instinct. Most hits were in the lower hull or turret ring area, exactly where doctrine specified but rarely achieved in actual combat. The ammunition expenditure was equally notable. 10 rockets fired, 10 effective hits achieved, 0 misses, 0 malfunctions. This perfect record was almost unprecedented in anti-tank combat, where hit rates typically ranged between 30 and 50% under ideal conditions. Garrett's loading performance had been flawless. Not a single fumbled rocket, not a single delayed reload, despite operating under fire in sub-zero temperatures while exhausted and terrified. The technical execution had been as close to perfect as combat ever allows. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. For American infantry who had spent weeks retreating and fighting desperate defensive actions, the engagement proved that German armor was not invincible. Tigers could be killed with weapons ordinary soldiers carried. Courage and skill could triumph over superior equipment. Morale, which had been cratering as the offensive gained ground, began recovering as word spread through the ranks that 10 Tigers had been stopped by 2 guys with a bazooka. For the Germans, the destruction of an entire Tiger battalion by a 2-man team was a catastrophe that transcended tactical defeat. These tanks were irreplaceable. Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing under Allied bombing, and every lost Tiger represented manufacturing resources that could not be recovered. More damaging was the psychological blow. If Tigers could not survive against infantry anti-tank weapons, then the fundamental premise of armored warfare, that tanks were mobile fortresses that dominated battlefields, had been disproven. The surviving tank crews would carry this knowledge into every subsequent engagement, making them cautious and hesitant when aggression was required. The broader implications became apparent over the following weeks. The Battle of the Bulge, which had seemed unstoppable in its first days, Eugene running out of momentum. Fuel shortages crippled German mobility. American reinforcements arrived faster than German planners had anticipated. The weather cleared, allowing Allied air power to savage German supply lines and armored columns. By January, the offensive had not just stalled but reversed, with German forces retreating under heavy pressure back to their original start lines. The engagement at the unnamed Crossroads village became a case study in defensive anti-tank tactics. Analysis identified several factors that contributed to Hendricks and Garrett's success. First, terrain that channeled enemy movement into predictable paths and limited maneuver options. Second, patience to allow targets to enter optimal firing positions rather than engaging at maximum range. Third, mobility between firing positions to avoid retaliation. Fourth, perfect technical execution under extreme stress. Fifth, and perhaps most critically, German decisions that prioritized speed over caution and resulted in tanks entering the kill zone without adequate infantry support. The lessons were incorporated into updated training doctrine. Bazooka teams were taught to emulate Hendricks's patient approach, wait for flank shots, never fire from frontal angles, change positions after every 2 shots, and always plan escape routes. The engagement proved that even heavy German armor could be defeated by infantry if the tactical conditions favored the defender. This knowledge emboldened American troops facing tanks and reduced the psychological dominance German armor had enjoyed. Recognition came slowly for Hendricks and Garrett. The initial Valor Award recommendations stalled in bureaucracy as officers argued about whether a single engagement, however extraordinary, merited the highest decorations. Hendricks was eventually awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest Valor Award behind the Medal of Honor. Garrett received the Silver Star. Both men found the attention uncomfortable and the decorations inadequate recognition for what they had experienced. Killing 33 men in 40 minutes, even enemy soldiers, was not something either man wanted celebrated. The German perspective was preserved in post-war interrogations and captured documents. The battalion commander who had ordered the advance despite initial losses was killed 3 days later in an unrelated engagement. His final radio transmissions revealed a man torn between operational necessity and tactical reality, ordering subordinates forward even as he recognized they were being destroyed piecemeal. Other surviving commanders criticized the decision to continue advancing after the first 3 tanks were destroyed, arguing that proper doctrine called for infantry reconnaissance and suppression before committing additional armor to an ambush site. The mythology that grew around the engagement often overshadowed the reality. Stories circulated claiming 20 Tigers destroyed or 50, or that Hendricks had single-handedly stopped an entire Panzer division. The actual facts, 10 tanks, 2 men, 40 minutes, were dramatic enough without embellishment, but embellishment happened anyway. Veterans who had been nowhere near the battle claimed to have witnessed it. Soldiers who had seen the aftermath added details that never occurred. Within months, the engagement had become legend, the kind of story troops told each other to maintain morale and belief in their own abilities. The physical site of the battle was cleared of wreckage in early 1945 after the Germans retreated. Salvage crews spent weeks cutting apart the destroyed Tigers, recovering usable components and hauling scrap metal away. The village itself was partially rebuilt, though many residents never returned. A small memorial was erected in 1947, listing the names of American soldiers who fought in the area but making no mention of the specific engagement. Hendricks visited once in 1952 and found nothing that triggered memories. The ruins had been cleared, the roads repaved, the scars of battle erased by time and reconstruction. Garrett never returned to Europe. He survived the war, came home to Oklahoma, married his high school sweetheart, and worked as a mechanic until retirement. He rarely spoke about the war and never about the battle specifically. When pressed by family or friends, he would only say that he had done his job under bad circumstances and was glad to have survived. The Silver Star went into a drawer and stayed there. The memories, which never faded, were locked away just as securely. Hendricks had a more difficult adjustment. The Distinguished Service Cross came with expectations, public appearances, interviews with reporters, speaking engagements at military bases. He endured these obligations with quiet discomfort, always deflecting praise and insisting that Garrett deserved equal credit. Post-traumatic stress was not well understood in the 1940s, and the nightmares and flashbacks that plagued him were treated as character weakness rather than combat trauma. He struggled with alcohol for several years before finding stability through work and family. The military analysis continued for decades. Staff officers at Fort Benning studied the engagement as an example of how infantry could defeat armor when terrain and tactics aligned favorably. The conclusion was not that bazookas made tanks obsolete, but rather that tanks required proper combined arms support to survive on battlefields where infantry carried effective anti-tank weapons. The Germans had learned this lesson the hard way in Russia. The Americans relearned it in Korea. The principle remained constant. Armor without infantry support is vulnerable, and vulnerability in combat is measured in lives. The personal cost was rarely discussed in official reports. Hendricks carried the weight of 33 deaths for the rest of his life. That they were enemy soldiers, that killing them was his duty, that their own actions had put them in harm's way, none of this erased the fact that he had killed them. The faces of the German tank crews he had seen burning, the screams he had heard, the smell of burning flesh and diesel fuel, these memories never faded. He did not regret his actions. He would do the same again if circumstances required. But he paid for those 40 minutes with decades of nightmares and a burden of memory that never lightened. War reduces grand strategy to individual moments where survival and duty intersect. The destruction of 10 Tigers in 40 minutes was not a turning point that changed the war's outcome. The Battle of the Bulge would have been won by the Allies regardless of this single engagement. Germany's defeat was inevitable once American industrial might and Soviet manpower combined to overwhelm Wehrmacht capabilities. But inevitability operates on the scale of nations and years. For the men who fought at that nameless crossroads on December 18, 1944, the engagement was everything. Life or death, victory or catastrophic defeat. Measure, not in strategic outcomes, but in whether they would survive the next minute. The story endures because it captures something essential about infantry combat. Two ordinary men armed with a weapon barely adequate to their task, facing odds that should have been insurmountable. They had no advantages except terrain, tactics, and the courage to remain in place when every instinct screamed to run. They succeeded not through superhuman ability, but through training, teamwork, and the kind of desperate determination that combat demands. Their victory was complete, their execution nearly flawless, and their reward was simply to keep living in a war that killed millions. The technical lessons were absorbed into doctrine and taught to generations of soldiers who would face their own versions of overwhelming armor. The psychological impact rippled through both armies, proving to Americans that they could win and demonstrating to Germans that their most fearsome weapons were not invincible. But perhaps the deepest legacy is what the engagement revealed about human capacity under extreme stress. Hendricks and Garrett found within themselves resources they did not know they possessed. They performed at levels training could prepare for, but not guarantee. They survived through skill and luck in proportions impossible to calculate. The German tank crews who died that morning were not monsters or villains. They were soldiers following orders, fighting for a cause many had come to doubt, trapped inside steel boxes that became their coffins when shaped charged jets penetrated armor and turned metal into shrapnel. Their courage in continuing to advance despite watching comrades burn was genuine even if the cause they served was not. War does not distinguish between brave men on the right side and brave men on the wrong side. It simply kills them both and leaves the survivors to make sense of what happened. What happened on that frozen December morning was simultaneously extraordinary and commonplace. Extraordinary in its outcome, 10 Tigers destroyed is remarkable by any measure. Commonplace in its components, fear, training, violence, death, survival. Every combat soldier who has ever loaded a weapon and waited for the enemy to come understands the essential experience, even if the specific details differ. The names change, the weapons evolve, the terrain shifts from Belgian forest to Pacific islands to Iraqi deserts. But the fundamental test remains constant. Can you function when death becomes probable? Can you do your job when failure means dying? Can you find courage when fear is overwhelming? Hendricks and Garrett answered yes. They did their job under circumstances where most men would have failed or fled. They killed effectively and survived intact. Whether that makes them heroes depends on definitions that vary by culture and circumstance. What it certainly makes them is examples of what human beings can achieve when necessity demands and training provides the framework for extraordinary performance. Their 40 minutes of combat taught lessons that military professionals still study, but the most important lesson is one that cannot be taught. That courage is not the absence of fear, but wrath. Or the ability to function despite it, and that such courage exists in ordinary men faced with extraordinary circumstances. The Tigers that burned on December 18, 1944, were eventually scrapped, their steel recycled, their crews buried or forgotten. The Crossroads village was rebuilt and life continued. Hendricks and Garrett returned to civilian lives where their wartime actions became stories told occasionally and reluctantly. The war ended, Europe healed. Memories faded for most but never for those who had been there when the tanks came through the fog and two men decided not to run. Their stand became history, then legend, and finally what it always should have been. A reminder that wars are fought not by nations but by individuals, and that individual courage, however brief its moment, can change the trajectory of battle and prove that invincibility is always an illusion waiting to be shattered.